There are some moments in history that don't just tweak things, they completely shatter the world as we know it and build something totally new from the pieces. And today, we're going to talk about one of the biggest of them all, the creation of the Atlantic world. This is way more than a story about some ships and exploration. Nope. This is the origin story of the planet we live on right now. So let's get right to the heart of it, right? The big question for this whole explainer is how? How could a single voyage, just one trip across the ocean back in 1492, trigger a chain reaction so massive it would literally reshape continents, smash cultures together, and even rewire the biology of our entire planet? It sounds like science fiction, but it's exactly what happened. To really get your head around just how huge this was, you have to think about it as a before and an after. It's that simple. In 1491, you had two completely different worlds, the Americas on one side, and Europe, Africa, and Asia on the other. They were basically two separate planets, biologically, culturally, you name it. Then came 1492, and suddenly those two planets didn't just meet, they crashed into each other. And after that collision, absolutely nothing was ever the same again. Okay, and this is so important to understand right up front. This was not a discovery of some empty, waiting land. Not at all. What it really was a collision, a sudden and often violent collision of three completely different worlds. You had the massive, complex empires of the Americas, the hyper-ambitious kingdoms of Europe, and the incredibly diverse cultures of West Africa, all crashing together for the very first time. Let's zoom in on those very first moments, right? And we can actually do that through Christopher Columbus's own journal. He talks about meeting the Taino people and describes this exchange, giving them little red caps and glass beads. And right there in that simple sentence, you can just feel it. You can feel the giant cultural divide, the huge potential for misunderstanding, and honestly, the power dynamic that was about to define the next 500 years. And yeah, that initial moment of contact, it turned into conquest. And it happened fast, really fast. Fueled by this intense drive for gold, glory, and God, these Spanish conquistadors, which literally just means conquerors, fanned out to claim huge territories for Spain. The age of exploration was over almost before it began. Now it was all about building an empire. So the big question is, how on earth did they do it? How did these tiny groups of a few hundred guys take down massive empires with millions of people, like the Aztecs and the Incas? Well, there were three key factors. First, weapons. Steel swords and cannons against arrows and clubs, it's just no contest. Second, they were smart about politics. They found local groups who hated being ruled by the Aztecs or Incas and turned them into allies. But the third weapon, that was their deadliest. It was completely invisible. Just look at that number for a second. 95%. Before I even tell you what it stands for, just let that sink in. Think about losing 95% of anything. It's almost impossible to imagine. Well, this is what it means. This chart shows it all. The native population of just central Mexico plummeted by an estimated 95% in less than 100 years. And the main reason, the primary killer, was that invisible weapon we just talked about, disease. Things like smallpox, measles, the flu, diseases the Europeans brought with them that the people in the Americas had absolutely no immunity to. It was the deadliest weapon of them all, and it paved the way for everything else. But it's really important to realize that not every European country had the same game plan. They all went about it differently. The Spanish and Portuguese, their model was basically conquest and extraction. Get the gold, get the sugar, and convert everyone to Catholicism. The French and the Dutch, they were more about business, specifically the fur trade. And for that, they needed to build working relationships with the Native American partners. And then you have the English. Their big idea was settlement. They brought families over to build towns and farms, which of course led to constant, brutal conflict over who actually owned the land. So, with the native population being decimated by disease, the European colonists had a huge problem, especially on those incredibly profitable but labor-intensive sugar and tobacco plantations. They needed workers. And the solution they came up with, well, it marks one of the darkest, most horrific chapters in the history of the world, the transatlantic slave trade. Now, this chart it's staggering. We're talking about 9.5 million people forcibly taken from Africa. But look closely at where they were sent. This is something a lot of people don't realize. The vast majority, we're talking almost 80%, were sent to Brazil and the Caribbean. to work on the absolutely brutal sugar plantations. British North America, the future United States, which gets so much of the focus, it actually received a pretty small percentage of the total number of enslaved people. And during the journey itself, the infamous Middle Passage. The human cost was just beyond belief. An estimated 20% of the captive Africans died on the voyage, 1 in every 5 people. You look at these diagrams of the slave ships, and you see how human beings were chained and packed in like cargo, with no room to even move. The conditions, the sickness, the sheer terror, it's just unimaginable. You know, numbers and diagrams, they can feel distant, abstract, but then you read the words of someone who lived through it. Olara Equiano was just a boy when he was forced to endure the Middle Passage, and his account, it makes it terrifyingly real. It reminds you that this wasn't about shipping cargo. This was a system of deliberate, soul-crushing cruelty forced upon millions of individual men, women, and children. Okay, so we've talked about the human impact, the conquests, the colonization, the slave trade. But this collision of worlds also kicked off something else, a full-on biological revolution that changed the planet forever. It's called the Columbian Exchange, and it's all about the massive transfer of plants, animals, microbes, and yes, diseases between the eastern and western hemispheres. So let's break that down. First, what went from the Americas to the rest of the world? Well, just try to imagine Italian food without tomatoes, or Swiss chocolate without cacao, or Irish history without the potato. Things like corn and potatoes were absolute game changers. They were cheap, easy to grow, and packed with calories, and they fueled a huge population explosion all across Europe and Asia. All right, so what about the other direction? What came from Europe, Africa, and Asia to the Americas? Well, you got livestock like horses, which totally revolutionized life for many Native American groups. You got staple foods like wheat and rice, and cash crops like sugarcane and coffee. But of course, there was also that last item on the list, the diseases, the smallpox, the measles, the flu, the things that had already caused so much devastation. And this image, wow, this is an illustration from the time made by an Aztec artist showing what smallpox did to people. It's a powerful, tragic reminder of the reality behind that bullet point. Because for every potato or tomato that made its way to Europe and improved life, a disease like this one swept through the Americas, causing unimaginable death. It was not an equal exchange, not by a long shot. And here's a fun fact for you, because it's so strange. You'd think Europeans would have jumped all over these amazing new foods, right? Nope. A lot of them were actually terrified. For years, tomatoes were just grown as pretty plants in the garden because people thought they were poisonous. And potatoes? Some people thought they caused leprosy. Seriously. It took a really long time before people trusted these foods that we now can't live without. So all of this massive, unprecedented movement of food, resources, and people back and forth across the Atlantic, it did more than just change what people ate. It completely rewrote the rules of the global economy. It was the birth of the economic world that we are still living in today. A huge part of that was the rise of capitalism. I mean, all of this new wealth flooding into Europe from the mines and plantations of the Americas, it created incredible new opportunities for profit. And suddenly it wasn't just kings and queens funding things. You had groups of private investors, merchants, pooling their money in what were called joint stock companies to fund colonial ventures, hoping to get rich. That's capitalism in a nutshell. And the main economic philosophy driving all of this was something called mercantilism. The way to think about it is simple. Countries believed there was a fixed amount of wealth, gold and silver, in the world, kind of like a giant pizza. And the goal of every country was to get the biggest slice. How do you do that? You get colonies. The colonies send you cheap raw materials, like cotton or wood. You turn those materials into expensive finished goods, like clothes or furniture, and then you sell them right back to your colonies. It's a closed system, designed to suck all the wealth back to the mother country. So let's wrap this all up. What are the big takeaways here? First, after 1492, the world was never the same. A truly global, interconnected network was born. Second, this created staggering wealth for Europe, but it was built on the unimaginable suffering of Native Americans and enslaved Africans. Third, it kicked off the biggest biological reshuffling in planetary history. And finally, all of this laid the foundation for the global economy we still operate in today, for better and for worse.
Which brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with. When you really think about it, almost everything about our modern world, the food we eat, the languages we speak, our economies, our populations, it all has roots that trace directly back to this collision that started in 1492. So the question is, when you look around today, what do you think is the most powerful, most enduring legacy of the Atlantic world?